Let's speak a little bit more about this with Advocate Mthokozisi Xulu, who is the President of the South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. Let's just first start with, we heard there the intention in terms of reviewing the ESCOM board because of the resignations, the lack of a permanent board for a long time. But in terms of state-owned entities, what is the ideal mix of skills or even experience?
Good evening, Mthokozisi. Thank you for having us. Good evening to the viewers. Well, I think the skill set of the SOE will be driven by its industry and its purpose in society. So depending on where you are, you will want to obviously have the subject matter experts being on the board to be able to share the experience and the expertise that they've garnered in this particular sector in which the SOE operates, and then the core skills then being supported by corporate governance experts, finance skills, strategy skills, and legal skills. But I think every SOE will be driven primarily by the core skill set required in that particular sector. So it will not be the same skills across the board, but we believe that it will be driven by the purpose and the requirements of the industry in which the SOE operates in.
And we've heard of late from various commentators about ESCOM and the skills that are seen as lacking, particularly those of engineers, saying, I heard Dr. Badilo Hotla, for instance, say you can't have an accountant run what is, in this case, the preserve, at least in what is required now of an engineer. But you as SACCI, you're questioning the processes that Cabinet follows in the selection, recruitment and retention, as well as the performance management of the leadership of SOEs. Why?
Because of the lessons that we've learned as a country. For the longest time, and I think innocently, the appointment of boards of SOEs, and I think in some cases the appointment of CEOs, were designed to be made by cabinet members through a shareholder representative, which is a minister. But if you look at the past decade and the deterioration in the performance of SOEs and the weaknesses at board level, it demonstrates that that model is no longer sustainable because the cabinet members themselves are overwhelmed by decisions that they need to take and the ability to identify the correct skills. So I think we are saying we need to change because we're realizing that there may not necessarily be subject matter expertise in cabinet to be able to determine who are the right people to sit on those boards. And therefore, that process needs to be modernized and be reviewed so that we can bring about skill set in our country that can define the recruitment process, define the expertise that are required, and somewhat define mechanisms for accountability so that cabinet can just focus on wide-ranging political oversight and not necessarily be saddled with the responsibility of having the insight of those appointments. And that's why we find ourselves here, because the challenges at cabinet level and sometimes the lack of depth of understanding makes an innocent decision of appointing a board a very catastrophic one that we see now with ESCOM, that what probably started off as a noble intent to renew and have a new board at ESCOM has led us to a board that is now resigning one by one, a board that probably does not have a quorum anymore. And it means that we cannot continue with depending on ministers to have the insight that we need to run these complex organizations. And therefore, we are calling for the introduction of probably a more scientific base of recruitment of board and senior management, and relieve the board, relieve the cabinet of that responsibility, because it's difficult for them to measure the performance if they themselves don't have the subject matter experience of running these complex organizations.
I mean, what you're saying seems to echo the repeated concerns and criticism by particularly opposition parties against the governing party and what they see and call cadre deployment. In fact, the governing party itself has acknowledged the extent thereof. So what you're saying is that there should be a clear separation between the state's ownership function and other state functions that may influence the operating, enforcement and market regulation. So how would that then be achieved going forward?
We as the South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry hold people accountable based on the public service that they've signed up for. And that's why it's important for us to gain public confidence if we are able to design a manner that is fair, is clear, and is able to be measured in terms of how people are recruited, and how talent is developed, how talent is retained, and also have a clear separation of the role of the shareholder, the independence of the board, and the oversight over executive management. And I think because we tended to club that whole value chain from the minister all the way to the CEO into one personality or one department, the lines typically get blurred because we do not have honest and public delineations of duties. So in most cases, every department seems to have their own style of how they oversee their SOEs. And what we are calling for, we want a universal, clear, professional system that oversees recruitment, performance, and retention of public servants, which in this case will be board and executive members. And in that way, we'll be able to understand it, because then we don't have to then have a challenge of sifting through the politics to understand what's going wrong, because there are competing debates in terms of which SOE performs better under which minister. But that is not sustainable, because you are leaving it to personalities, and you are going to get the country into the trouble that we are with ESCOM now. So what we are calling for is a new dimension, which will help the country to be able to understand exactly what we're dealing with, and in the process drive meritocracy and greater sense of accountability, and I guess better performance management and accountability timelessly, so that we don't have various committees that are not legislated overseeing SOEs and wasting the country's time, because over the years and interventions at ESCOM, no one can really tell you when things got wrong, because we've layered and layered ESCOM with all sorts of unlegislated and in some cases lack of legal instruments to oversee ESCOM, and therefore we can't hold anyone accountable.
Mthokozisi, I want to talk about the legal instruments. So there are those who talk about streamlining of SOEs, including incorporating it into ordinary company law. Now, in terms of the obligations and responsibilities borne by an SOE, it's required to undertake commercial functions in a transparent manner, and of course that should be clearly mandated, disclosing to the public the costs normally covered by the company, etc., etc. So in relation to company law, the fact that it is a state-owned entity, where does one begin, where does one end? Is that streamlining possible where it bears more the characteristic of private enterprising?
Yes, and this process that we are calling for will also help us to really clarify, the relationship of the Companies Act and the Public Finance Management Act, because those two instruments in some cases are conflicting, and there are some challenges that you find in PMFA that cause troubles for the operations and the governance of state-owned enterprises. So I guess we can lean more towards the Companies Act, but obviously being a public enterprise, we'll then have to find ways of building in the public accountability and the transparency that is required by the Constitution in terms of how these entities are run. But we've had instances, even besides the appointment of boards, just the mere operation is slowed down by how the PMFA relates to the Companies Act. And I think it's about time that we modernize, call it public sector company law, in a way that promotes activity, agility, and accountability of SOEs, while still maintaining the prescripts of the Constitution around fairness and transparency of governance. So it would most likely call upon for a new law if we are really to save these SOEs.
Thank you for your time and insights, Advocate Mthokozisi Xulu, the President of the South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Of course, they have been calling for a reimagining of how boards of SOEs are appointed.